So I've created a folder where there will be two subfolders. So first will be server, and the second will be client, but we will create the client using npx create app. So let's just split the terminal. This will be for server, so let's just go into server, and this will be for React. So we will say npx create React app, and this will be called client, and template TypeScript. So this is installing. And here we will say npm init-y, and we should see a package.json, yes. And here we will say yarn, because I'm using yarn. We will say, I'm sorry, I have a bad stomach. Yarn add express types, express types node mongoose types mongoose bcrypt JS types bcrypt JS, and then we will say JSON web token types JSON web token, and then we will say what else do we need? Norman TypeScript. Now let's try with these. So now we have a client, and then we also need a .getignore file where we will ignore server node modules, server env, client node modules, client env. So now we have these packages, and let's create a script. So I'm going to create a start script, and it will be nodeman let's call the intro file themes.js. This will be themes. teams.js, and here teams, actually source teams.js, TS, and this will be TS, actually JS, and this will be dev, and here we'll say TSC /p and punctum and dot. So in this server, let me just get rid of the C#. Let me take a look, 1 second. This one, uninstall. Let me just reload. Doesn't matter. So in the server we will create a folder called stores, and here we'll create a file called themes.ts, and for now let's just console log hello world. So if we go to terminal and split it and go to server and say yarn start, TS node is not recognized. Okay, so we will need to say yarn add TS node and then yarn start hello world. There we go. So now we will also need yarn add socket.io and types socket.io. Okay, so here we will also need a file called app.ts, and this will be export default class app, and it will say public async init, and here we will need private app will be application, we will need to import application from Express, and here we'll say this app equals new application. No, sorry. This app equals Express. And here if we say like this, we cannot import this. So we will say Express. And now we have an app. Now we will create a file called db.ts. And here we will import Mongoose from Mongoose, and here we will say export default class db public async init, and in the server we will need a file called .env. And in env we will say MongoDB key or connection string, and this will be called MongoDB localhost 27017. We'll call it Teams. Right, so the next thing we'll need is add .env and types.env. So in app we'll need to say import path from path, and here we will say import config from .env, and then say config one second, I forgot how to do this. .env TypeScript example source lib env. So this will say path that resolve dir name .env, like so. And then in the env file we will need to say node port, and we'll say 5000. So here we will say this app listen process env node port, and here we will say console log server started on port process env node port. And in our themes we will say import app from app and const app new app app.init. Now we'll say yarn start. Let's see if we did everything right. Okay, so what we need to do is in our source file cd source, we need to say or like this npx tsconfig json no. Let's try again. Okay, so we have a port in use, so let's just kill it. Again. Okay, so now we have this. So now we will say init here, so we will say mongoose.connect process env mongodb connection string, and then we will say console the log connected to MongoDB. like so. And here we will say import db from db, and here we will say private init db. So const db equals new db and db.init. So here we will say it is dot init db. Let's see. Okay, so we will need to say it's called use new URL parser true and use unified topology to true. And now we're connected. So now we will need to say, okay, so we're connected and to the database and to the Stacker.io server. So now we will need to say where was it? Here we will say import server from Stacker.io as IO server well, we need a server, so actually we need to say import server as HTTP server from HTTP. And this will be const HTTP server HTTP server, and then we'll say we will also need import IO, so we'll say const IO server equals IO and then HTTP server. Okay, so I will need to make a there we go. We made a change. So now I will say source new file, no, actually source new folder services, and in this one I will say new file, and this will be called IO service.ts. And here we'll say export default class IO service, and this will say public static async init, and it will take in an IO server, so we will need to import this, import server as IO server from stack.io, server IO server, server on connection, and we will get a socket, and we can say console.log socket connected or client connected, and then, or maybe we could say with socket ID, socket ID. So in here we will say import IO service from services IO service, and here we'll say const IO, no wait, this is a thing, so we'll need to say IO service dot init IO server. Here we go. But why are we getting this? I don't know. I know why. I think because we have this. Now we will say our start again, and now we don't have anything. Well, it's working because we saw before that it actually initialized and connected our client to the server. So now we can make some interfaces and models. So we'll create a folder called interfaces and a folder called models. And in our interfaces we will create a file called iuser.ts, and this will import document from Mongoose, and this will export interface iuser extend document. We will need a ID string. We will need created at, which will be a date. Updated at will be a date, and we will say display name will be a string. Email will be a string. Password will be a string, and role will be a string. So this is it for now, and now we will say models, create new file, user.ts, and here we will say import mongoose from mongoose, and here we will say const user schema equals new mongoose schema, and here we will say timestamps true. Sorry. So here we will say display name will be string, email will be string, password will be string, and role will be string. Now we will say user schema pre save, and this will be an async function, and we will say const user equals this if this not this is modified password, and we will have a next function here, so return next, and here we will say we will also need bcrypt, so import bcrypt from bcrypt.js, and here we will say const hash password equals bcrypt dot hash user dot password and 10 rounds, and this will be actually any hash password will be await bcrypt dot hash, and now we will say user password equals hash password, and now await user dot save, and now next. Now we will say export default const user equals new equals mongoose model user schema and users. Export default user, and this will be iUser. So now we have a model. So now in our we need a folder called controllers, and in this folder we will create a file called user controller.ts, and we will import iUser from interfaces user iUser, and import user from models user, and here we will say export default class user controller, and here we will say public static async. We will say first we will say register, and we will also need import request and response from express, and this will say request response, and here we will say we will need false here. So here we will say, first we will need to check if the email exists of the user that was that is trying to create. So first we will say const email exists equals await user dot count documents no actually user find one email will be rec body email to lowercase, and this will be an iUser or no. So if email exists, return res send res status for one send message email already exists. So now we will say const new user equals new user, and we'll take rec body and then say await new user, let's save. Now we will need to say in our env jwt secret, and for now let's just say like so. Now we have a user created, so we will need a token, and to do that we will import jwt from JSON web token, and now we will say jwt dot sign, and we will say user ID new user ID, and here we will say process env jwt secret or 1 2 3, and here we will say res.send token. So this is our I don't want this error, so we will say false to this as well, and this will be saved. So now here we will say public static async login, and we will need parameters, so res and response and request response. So here we will say const email and password equals rec body. So now const user iUser or no await user, let's find one email to lower case. If not user, return res.status for one send message could not log you in. And now const password equals await bcrypt. We need bcrypt as well, so import bcrypt from bcrypt.js, compare password to user password. If not password equals, we will just have the same response, and here we will say const token with variable user. So now we have a login in place, and now we'll need a function that will check continuously if we are logged in or not. So an init function for our React init rec request res response const user ID will be string or undefined, and this will be actually res locals user ID. If, and here we will say let user a user or no. If user ID actually if user ID, then we will say user equals await user that's find by ID user ID. And we will say res send user. And here we will say no. And now we will need some middleware. So new folder, middleware, new file is user.ts, and this will import request response next function from express, and we will say export default function that will take request response next. So const token equals rec headers authorization split like so, and then number one, the second element in the array, which will be our token. So if not token, return next, else we'll say res locals, no, actually first we'll need to say user ID any, and then any, and here we'll say import JWT from JSON Web Token, and here we'll say JWT verify token, and then process env JWT secret or 123. If not user ID, return next, else res locals user ID equals user ID, and then next. So now in our app.ts we will have a function called private init middleware, and here we will need to import our middleware. So is user middleware from middleware is user, and we will say this app that use is user middleware, and we will need to say this dot init middleware and see if everything works. Yes, it does. It does. So now we will say actually we have a server that accepts authentication now, so we should be able to create some client in React. So now we will say client and then yarn start. And now we have a clean React application. So we will actually need to remove these things. Now we have it like this. So we will need to say this one, and this one, and this one we will delete, and in our index we will delete this. Now querying your terminal, we'll say cd client yarn add react router dom types react router dom. And here we'll say import browser router from React router dom, and you say browser router here. There we go. And now I want some Tailwind CSS, so I will say Tailwind React. So this is a tutorial, and I will need to have yarn add tailwind CSS post CSS CLI and auto prefixer. Here we go. And now we'll see npx tailwind init tailwind JS full. So npx tailwind init tailwind JS full. And in this one I will say variant, and it's called opacity. And say disabled. And we will also need what was it called? Disabled cursor pointer. Responsive and disabled. So now we have this, and we will create a file called post css config.js. So in the client, create a file post css config.js, and we'll say const tailwind css equals require tailwind css module export equals an object, and we'll say plugins tailwind CSS tailwind.js, and then require auto prefixer. And then the client will create a file called tailwind.css, and in this one we will say tailwind base and tailwind components and tailwind utilities. And in our package.json, first we need to create a proxy to HTTP localhost port 5000. And in our script we will say build.tailwind and here we will say post CSS tailwind the CSS output source main.css or actually just tailwind.css. So now we can say yarn build tailwind, and it should work. Here we go. Now we have tailwind CSS. Going back to our React project, here we will have some styles that I will create later. Let me just wait for this to complete. Actually, in this here we can just say import tailwind.css. There we go. Okay, guys. I code about 4 to 5 hours daily, but that's because I go to school where we have a lot of projects, and yeah, and I also code in my free time. So let me just show you my Waka time results. So over the past 7 days I've coded 22 hours and 43 minutes, and over the last 14 days I coded 55 hours and 52 minutes. So yeah, let me just take a 2-minute break. I get a smoke and I'll be back. See you guys. Okay, guys, I'm back. So this file I will save in CSS. In our app.tsx, first I will create a folder called interfaces, and I will copy this interface here, except I will delete this, and I will delete this, and this will be optional. This will be optional This will be optional. And we just close everything. Close the server. So here we will need a few things. So let me think. We will need to say const user set user equals use state a user or null use effect will be a function, and here we will say init and here we will say const init equals async function. And also we will need to create a HTTP client. So in source we'll create a folder called services, and here we will create a file called http client.ts. And here we will actually need to say yarn add axios types axios. So here we will say import axios from axios, and here we will export default like so, and here we will say const token equals local storage get item token. And here we'll say const default options equals headers authorization will be bearer and token. Actually here we will say token like so, or empty string otherwise, and here we will say return get will be a function that will create axios.get, and here we will say URL options and here we will say URL, and then default options, and then options URL string. And now post URL string data any and options like so, and this will be axios.post URL data default options. Here we go. So now we will need to import this HTTP client from services HTTP client, and here we will need to say const data equals await HTTP client dot get. It will be API auth init. Like so. There we go. And now we will say if data user set user data user. Here we go. Like so. What's the error here? There we go. So now we should have a error here saying not found. So not found, cannot get, because we didn't create a route. So here in storage we will create a folder called routes, and here we will say auth routes.ts, and actually this controller will be renamed to auth controller.ts. So here we will import router from Express and import auth controller from controllers auth controller, and say const router export default router, and here we will say router.get, and it will be called init, and this will be auth controller.init, router.post login will be auth controller.login, and router post register will be auth controller register. And now we shall import the routes here. Import auth routes from routes, auth routes, and here we will say private init routes, and this will be list app use API auth and be auth routes. And we will need to use that as well. So this dot init routes and now we still have that. Okay, we need to restart this because our proxy didn't kick in. Now let's take a look. Five thousand invalid signature. Auth routes init it's going through the middleware. What does that mean? I think it needs to be to string. Let's take a look. Still. Let me take a look at my other repository. Okay. So actually I'm going to use passport because that's what I wanted to do anyways. So first thing I will need to say is passport local, passport AWT. Okay. So go to cd server, yarn add passport local, passport GWT, types passport, types passport local, types passport GWT. And in services we will need to create a new file called passport service.ts. And we will need to say a few things. So export default class passport service, and we're going to say public static async init. But before that we will need to say import passport from passport, import passport local from passport local, import passport JWT from passport JWT, and say const local strategy equals passport local strategy, const JWT strategy equals passport JWT dot strategy, and here we will say passport dot use new local strategy username field email async email password, and done. We will need to say import user from models user, const user equals await user find one email to lowercase, if not user then return done, no message wrong email. And actually we can take from auth controller our this function. We will need to import bcrypt, and here we will just say this. So return done, null, and user. And under here we will say passport.serialize user function user done no user and passport.deserialize user function user done no user. And here we will say public static async authenticate JWT and we will need this request plus response use a passport authenticate JWT. Then we have JWT strategy, yes, so we will need also passport.use new JWT strategy, JWT from request extract and const extract JWT passport JWT extract JWT extract JWT from of as bearer token, and here secret or key will be process env JWT secret or 123. And here we will have a function called the sync JWT token and done. And we'll say const user equals await user defined by ID JWT token user ID. If not user, return done, no message could not arguing. Otherwise, return done, no user. And here we have passport authenticate JWT. So we have error user info. If error throw new error authenticating JWT If not, user, we will also need next function. Next function. If not, user, return next. Otherwise, res locals user ID equals user ID next. And here we will say rec res next. And actually I have a controller here that will authenticate local, so I will also create it in service this time. So public static async authenticate local request sorry, passport authenticate local, right? And we will have error, user, and info. So let's copy these. Send message could not log you in. Const token equals gwt dot sign. We need gwt as well. User ID, process env jwt secret or 123 res send token. Here we go. So now we don't log in. We will say import passport service from services passport service, and here we will no longer need this, and this will be passport service authenticate local, right? Let me take a look. I'm not sure actually. Yeah, authenticate local. One thing, let me just make everything uppercase. Authenticate local init. And now in our app.ts we will say init middleware, but we will need to say no longer need this, but we will say import passport service from services passport service dot authenticate JWT. Okay, take a look. Fuck. Okay, so here we will need to say output service in it. One more time, and now we have a user null. Okay guys, so now we have login initialization in place. So for now I think that's it, because I have some other things to do. So I'll see you guys tomorrow, or maybe later today. So bye guys.